Bernard Hopkins' longevity is amongst the most impressive in boxing history. Symbolised, most iconically, by being the oldest fighter to ever win a world title, Hopkins would continue to fight the best fighters in the world into his 50s. Hopkins' run as a top-level fighter in his 40s is Hall of Fame worthy alone. Past the age of 40, Hopkins would defeat the likes of Jean Pascal, Kelly Pavlik, Roy Jones, Tavoris Cloud, Winky Wright, as well as facing the likes of Joe Calzaghe, Sergey Kovalev and Jermaine Taylor. But even before that iconic run, he was middleweight champion of the world for 10 years, making 20 successful title defences, defeating the likes of William Joppy, Oscar De La Hoya, pound-for-pound star Felix Trinidad, and many others, with one of the craftiest styles ever seen. Charlie Burley, in my opinion, is both the most underrated fighter and the most avoided fighter in history. Being active during the war years, the middleweight title was put on hold, and even when it became available again, many of the top fighters avoided him. Names like Sugar Ray Robinson, Marcel Cerdan, Tony Zale, Jake LaMotta would all opt to not fight Burley. Weighing anywhere between 147 to 160 pounds, Burley took on much bigger competition. Whilst being avoided by many world champions, he did beat a few all-time great world champions in Archie Moore and Fritzy Zivic. Burley made his name in the infamous Black Murderers Row group, a group of legendary Black Hall of Famers that were so good and so avoided at their time that the top champions opted not to fight them, so they had to fight each other, and Burley was always considered the best of the bunch. Amongst his wins against Archie Moore, Fritzy Zivic and all of the Hall of Famers in the Black Murderers Row, Burley also moved up to heavyweight to TKO a heavyweight challenger, despite not weighing much more than welterweight. He was unbelievably slick, crafty and used the shoulder roll in the 1940s, and his fist packed legendary power, scoring 50 knockouts against mainly bigger competition. Eddie Futch, Ray Arcel and Archie Moore all have Burley in the top 1 or 2 greatest fighters they've ever seen or fought. The lightweight champion of the world, Lou Ambers, was a clever, aggressive boxer. Despite having a low guard, he used to make shots miss with crafty head movement, excellent footwork and a subtle ability to ride shots. You'll notice in recent years, top defensive fighters like Canelo and Floyd Mayweather have used these tricks. But Ambers was an aggressive fighter and was able to outslug some of the greatest fighters that have ever lived up close. Ambers scored one of the most impressive victories ever seen in the 1939 Fight of the Year, outslugging the great Henry Armstrong. Ambers was the only man to defeat Armstrong in his prime, an unmatched 61 fight streak in which Armstrong beat everyone he faced from featherweight to middleweight across a 3-year span, scoring 51 knockouts. Alongside his victory over Henry Armstrong, Ambers beat an array of Hall of Famers, including 2 wins against the all-time great Tony Canzonieri and an additional 2 wins over Hall of Famer Baby Arizmendi. Further Hall of Famers and champions in Fritzy Zivic, Coco Kid, Frankie Click, Pedro Montanez, Johnny Jadick and Albummy Davis would all be defeated by the great Lou Ambers. Unfortunately, there's no footage of the great Abe Patel in his prime, but the featherweight champion of the world for nearly a decade was one of the most complete fighters of the early 20th century. Over 110 years after his reign, it still remains the 3rd longest in the division's history, where his colossal 9-year reign was instantly overtaken by his rival Johnny Kilbane, who ruled for 11 years. Patel would make an astonishing 22 defences of his title, losing just 3 of his 17 career fights against Hall of Famers in George Dixon, Owen Moran, Battling Nelson, George K.O. Cheney and Johnny Kilbane. The real deal Evander Holyfield is a genuine modern day boxing legend and for a long time was the only undisputed cruiserweight and heavyweight champion of the world. After a brilliant run at cruiserweight where he would have all-time great fights against Dwight Muhammad Qawi and clear out the division, he moved up to one of the most competitive heavyweight eras in history to once again become undisputed champion. Holyfield's resume as a heavyweight is absolutely staggering, with knockout wins over Mike Tyson, a victory over George Foreman and Riddick Bowe in one of the greatest trilogies in history, 2 fights against Lennox Lewis, a victory over Michael Moore, Larry Holmes, Ray Mercer and many others. Evander's warrior heart saw him in some of the most exciting fights of the decade. He was extremely athletic, blessed with beautiful boxing skills and an ability to throw explosive combination punches. His excellent fights against Riddick Bowe and Dwight Muhammad Qawi are respectively some of the greatest in their division's history. He would continue to box for many years, even fighting the largest ever heavyweight champion, Nikolai Valuev, in a fight many believe he deserved to win. In total, he was a 5-time heavyweight world champion. One of history's most menacing welterweights, Tommy Hearns was an absolute nightmare. Tall, rangy, with a right hand blessed from the gods, Hearns terrorised some of the greatest fighters of all time, with his iconic right hand blitzing the likes of Pepino Cuevas and most famously Roberto Duran in one of the most brutal knockouts in history. His super fights against Marvin Haggler and the first fight against Sugar Ray Leonard are both deemed to be the greatest fights in history. And whilst he lost both of those fights, many believe he deserved the rematch against Ray Leonard in an entertaining battle. In total, Hearns would accumulate 5 weight division titles, from welterweight all the way up to light heavyweight. The great Sandy Sadler was an absolute monster of a featherweight and one of history's hardest ever punchers. Completely towering over his opposition, Sadler would accumulate 104 career knockouts over 145 wins. The 2-time featherweight champion of the world has one of the most stacked resumes in boxing history, knocking out the great Willie Pep on 3 different occasions. He would also blast away the Hall of Famer Joe Brown, knocking the 1961 Fighter of the Year out in 2 rounds, as well as beating Hall of Famer Charlie Riley, the legendary Flasher Lord, as well as world champions in Phil Terranova, Harold Dade, Lauro Salas twice, and scoring a draw against the world champion Jimmy Carter. Sadler was one of the roughest, toughest and dirtiest fighters of all time. Despite being far taller than his opposition, he would opt to walk them down and continuously bludgeon some of the greatest fighters of all time. Rocky Marciano remains the only undefeated world champion in the heavyweight division's history. The legendary heavyweight would compile a perfect 49-0 record with 43 brutal knockouts. Rocky's style was one of the most relentless in history. He never stopped throwing punches, and despite being pretty small for heavyweight standards, he was blessed with some of the hardest fists ever. Although his reign was shorter than many of the great champions to follow, his 4-year reign has left an impact much bigger than those that reigned for longer. He would score victories against all-time greats in Jersey Joe Walcott twice, most famously in the first fight, knocking Walcott out when down on the cards, whilst beating the all-time great Ezra Charles twice and stopping the old mongoose Archie Moore. The legendary Larry Holmes is one of the most dominant heavyweight champions in history. At one point in time, Larry had compiled a record of 48-0 with 34 knockouts, compiling a staggering 20 consecutive title defences over a reign which had lasted more than 7 years. And it's hard not to put Holmes down as one of the most complete heavyweights of all time. Tall, powerful, extremely athletic, and blessed with smooth footwork, reminiscent of those great heavyweights of the 70s, Holmes was able to completely demolish his opposition, setting everything up with the greatest jab history's ever seen in my opinion. And whilst Holmes may have had the most formidable lead hand in history, I also feel his recuperative skills, showing a freakish ability to recover from the hardest punches ever landed and overcoming severe adversity to still find a way to win, is almost unmatched. The greatest 15th round ever against Ken Norton and that dynamite right hand Ernie Shavers landed are 2 prime examples of this. During his reign as champion, Holmes would defeat the likes of Ken Norton, Jerry Cooney, Tim Witherspoon, Ernie Shavers twice, Leon Spinks, Tex Cobb, Trevor Berbick, Bone Crusher Smith, and an albeit past his best Muhammad Ali. The toy bulldog Mickey Walker is easily one of the most interesting boxers in history. One of the most exciting fighters of the first half of the 20th century. A man with one of the greatest resumes in history who would at times fight drunk, beating great fighters from lightweight all the way up to heavyweight. The ultra-aggressive Walker, who stood at just 5'7", started his career at welterweight. But he would defeat Hall of Famers Dave Shade and legendary welterweight champion Jack Britton to win the welterweight title. Walker would hold the welterweight title for 4 years, retaining it on several occasions. During his welterweight reign, where he defeated the all-time great Lou Tendler, between welterweight defences, he would move up to face Harry Greb for the middleweight title in the fight of the decade, whilst also defeating the Hall of Famer Mike McTeague for the light heavyweight title during his welterweight reign, but didn't capture the crown as this was a KO title fight only, meaning Walker could only win the title via knockout. Then after losing his welterweight title, he beat the all-time great Tiger Flowers controversially to become middleweight world champion. Whilst winning world title fights all the way from welterweight to light heavyweight and facing the greatest fighters ever, Walker was arguably yet to pull off his greatest work. Standing at just an inch taller than Roberto Duran, Walker would then move to the heavyweight division, where he would defeat heavyweight contenders King Levinsky and Paulina Wazkudin, as well as drawing with Jack Sharkey in a fight many thought he won. Later that year, Jack Sharkey became heavyweight champion of the world. Walker would lend loose to the great Max Schmeling, and even after that, defeated the all-time great light heavyweight Maxi Rosenblum. George Foreman was one of the most ferocious fighters in history. Blessed with otherworldly power, the haymakers George would throw would stop some of the greatest and most durable fighters ever seen. During the first part of his career, the young, formidable Foreman blitzed the great Joe Frazier on 2 separate occasions, whilst blasting away heavyweight champion Ken Norton. His legendary rumble in the jungle against Muhammad Ali is deemed to be the biggest fight in boxing history, and his fight against the formidable Ron Lyle was one of the most brutal in history, ending in an epic knockout win. Yet it's Foreman's second run in his 40s, becoming history's oldest heavyweight champion, which cements him as such an all-time great. He would go toe-to-toe with top peak fighters in Tommy Morrison and Evander Holyfield, whilst knocking out Jerry Cooney with one of the smoothest knockouts ever, finally landing an iconic right hand against heavyweight champion Michael Moore to become boxing's oldest ever heavyweight champion at 46. In 76 wins, he scored a staggering 68 knockouts and was only ever stopped once in 81 pro fights. Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker is undeniably one of the greatest defensive fighters in history, and was also one of the most fascinating fighters to watch because he was so talented and could seemingly make shots miss even when completely off balance. Whitaker was a crisp southpaw, able to put together silky, snappy and precise punches against his aggressive opponents, but most impressively, he would make an array of history's most formidable punchers miss with complete ease. Over his career, he accumulated titles in 3 weight divisions, defeating the likes of Buddy McGirt, Greg Horgan, Azuma Nelson, Jose Luis Ramirez, and many others. In my eyes, I feel he was robbed of his signature victory against the primed and undefeated Julio Cesar Chavez, while also giving the great Oscar De La Hoya an extremely close fight. The great Barney Ross may have one of the most fascinating stories in boxing history. One of boxing's first 3 division champions and a decorated World War II veteran, Ross was forced to endure and overcome a hellacious amount of adversity in his life. Between 1933 to 1935, he won titles in 3 weight divisions from lightweight to welterweight. After losing a few early fights in his career, in his peak, for over a decade, he lost just once to the great Jimmy McClarnin in a fight many thought he won. Across those years, he defeated many Hall of Famers, accumulating an all-time great resume, beating Tony Canzonieri twice, Jimmy McClarnin twice, Billy Petroli twice, Frankie Click, battling Battolino, Izzy Gennazo, and middleweight champion Seferino Garcia 3 times. He would ultimately lose his final career fight and the welterweight title to the unrelenting Henry Armstrong. In 81 professional fights, in one of boxing's most brutal eras, he was never stopped. After his career as a fighter, Ross would serve in the Second World War in Guadalcanal. Ross and his comrades were ambushed and trapped under enemy fire. With the other men wounded, Ross grabbed all of their grenades and rifles, fighting off the Japanese forces single-handedly. 2 of the men died that night, and Ross carried the 3rd to safety, ultimately being awarded the Silver Star. During his recovery in hospital, he would ultimately become addicted to morphine and would suffer with that addiction for years. Joe Gans is a true pioneer of the sport and a revolutionary boxer in many senses. The Old Master was the first African-American world champion of the 20th century. He was widely regarded as the most skillful fighter of the era, possessing skills and tricks that just weren't seen in that time. He won the lightweight title over Hall of Famer Frank Hearn in 1902. Over 6 years, successfully defending it 15 times, scoring 11 knockouts in those fights. He would skillfully judge distance, getting in and out of range with one of the all-time great jabs. Gans was a master boxer and an excellent counter-puncher, blessed with heavy hands, scoring 100 career knockouts. Despite being levels ahead of the competition, he would ultimately have to dig in a brutal era. At times, he would fight multiple opponents in one day, and would even beat the Hall of Famer Battling Nelson in round 42 of a grueling war. He would score victories over Hall of Famers in Jimmy Britt, Battling Nelson, Jack Blackburn, Mike Sullivan, George McFadden, Frank Hearn, and many others, beating most of these names multiple times. In his brilliant peak, Roy Jones Jr. is one of the most dominant and talented fighters I've ever seen. Completely untouchable, barely losing a round in over 10 years. He was one of the fastest and most dynamic aggressive fighters I've ever seen, whilst using freakish reflexes and athleticism to make himself nearly impossible to hit clean. Both his punches and escapes would come from all different kinds of angles his opponents just couldn't work out. Jones would score excellent wins in his career against James Toney, Bernard Hopkins, Virgil Hill, Felix Trinidad and Mike McCallum towards the end of their careers, John Ruiz to become heavyweight champion, Antonio Tarver and many others. He was the first man in over a century to officially become the champion from middleweight all the way up to heavyweight, doing this around his first 50 fights and looking seemingly invincible in doing so. The 1930s was known as the golden era for the lighter weight divisions in boxing. There were so many top 50 all-time greats that all fought each other multiple times, and Tony Canzonieri was amongst the best. He was a genius-level boxer with many astonishing record-breaking feats and one of boxing's first 3 division champions, winning titles from featherweight to light welterweight, and he would also defeat the bantamweight world champion Bud Taylor in one of 3 fights. Upon winning his first world title at featherweight, Canzonieri was just 18 years old, making him the youngest world champion in the sport for a very long time. And at that age, he already had 2 Hall of Famers on his resume. And the very next year would defeat Hall of Famer Benny Bass, and at just the age of 21 would move up to challenge the world champion Sammy Mundell. Canzonieri knocked the Hall of Famer Al Singer out in the first round, whilst also defeating the Hall of Famer Kid Chocolate twice, as well as the all-time great Jack Kid Bird. He then defeated the light welterweight champion Battling Shaw for the title, whilst taking on the legendary Barney Ross twice. Past his best, well over 100 fights in, he would still defeat further Hall of Famers in Baby Arismendi, Jimmy McLarnin and Lou Ambers to regain the title. His resume is unbelievable, with over 30 fights against primed all-time greats, and his style is one of the slickest in boxing history. And whilst being in many 15-round wars in one of boxing's most brutal eras, he was only ever stopped once in 175 fights. Marvellous Marvin Haggler was one of the most disciplined, determined, aggressive fighters the sport's ever seen. This willingness to outwork everybody and walk through the sport's biggest ever punches saw Haggler completely dominate the middleweight division across the stacked 1980s. But besides his warrior spirit and toughness, he was an underrated, skillful boxer with excellent defence, one of the all-time great jabs, and arguably the most consistent switch hitting in history. And despite reigning for 7 years as one of history's most formidable middleweights, Haggler was forced to endure one of the hardest roads to the title in modern history. He would have extremely tough fights early in his career in Philadelphia, where he would draw with Sugar Ray Seals, lose to Bobby Watts controversially, and be outpointed by Willie Monroe. But Haggler would ultimately avenge all these blemishes, as well as defeating tough fighters like Benny Briscoe and Kevin Finnegan on his way to the title. His first shot at the title against Vito Antuofermo was controversially scored a draw. But after massacring Alan Minter in his 54th professional fight, he was finally crowned middleweight champion in 1980. During his reign, he would defeat Vito Antuofermo, Mustafa Hamsho, Tony Simpson, Roberto Duran, and Tommy Hearns and John Mugabe in 2 of the greatest fights in history, amongst many other opponents. His final career fight would be a razor-tight loss to Sugar Ray Leonard, who ultimately ended up being the only man to defeat Haggler outright in his entire career. There's no boxer off the top of my head that I can think of that had to overcome so much adversity and oppression to achieve greatness as Jack Johnson. The first black heavyweight champion in history, Johnson was active during a time in America where black fighters weren't even allowed to get a title shot. And even before his run as champion, Johnson would defeat some of the greatest black boxers to ever exist, a group of formidable international boxing Hall of Famers who history has sadly forgotten, due to the horrendous racism at the time, which halted their career's potential. Yet Johnson, the son of a former slave who grew up in poverty, would refuse to live like this, chasing the heavyweight title for years until he got his shot against Tommy Burns in Australia. After he knocked out Burns for the title, he was scheduled to fight James J. Jeffries in the fight of the century. Yet after Johnson battered the former champion, race riots were sparked all across America where many were killed due to the outrage of the result. Johnson's influence in the sport is unprecedented. During extremely severely racist times, he had the bravery and confidence to live as a free man, with a talent and physique well beyond his years, able to dominate all in his division. Johnson was huge and extremely strong for the time period, and although his style may look dated, he was a defensive genius of the time, moving in a way that no heavyweight had ever moved before. It's unbelievable what he achieved in his life with so much stacked against him, and his resume is incredible too, holding victories over all-time greats in Stanley Ketchel, Sam Langford and Bob Fitzsimmons, while scoring victories against Black Hall of Famers who were restricted to the coloured world heavyweight title in Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, Denver Ed Martin and young Peter Jackson. During his time as heavyweight champion, he would defeat the world champion Tommy Burns, Hall of Famer Jim Jeffries, Hall of Fame light heavyweight champion Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, and the only man to knock out Jack Dempsey in fireman Jim Flynn. The way the ghetto wizard Barney Leonard was able to move for a fighter of his era is just unfathomable. Considering he was in his prime in the 1910s, Leonard looks like a modern day boxer who's been teleported back a century into the old school. He may well have possessed the greatest ring IQ in boxing history, being able to not only outbox his opposition, but having heavy hands too and great punch placement, scoring 70 career knockouts. The great trainer Ray Leonard said that Barney Leonard was the greatest fighter he'd ever seen, and this is a man who trained a prime Roberto Duran. In his peak, he was one of the most dominant fighters in history and is still regarded as the second greatest lightweight champion ever. He ruled for 7 years and 7 months, which over a century later is still the longest reign ever seen in a division. Most of Leonard's losses were taken early on as a teenager, where he was still learning the craft, but once he hit his peak, he would lose just twice in 117 fights during his reign as champion. He would defeat Hall of Famers and world champions in Pinky Mitchell, Lou Tendler, Rocky Kansas 3 times, Freddie Welsh, Charlie White, James Herring, Joe Benjamin, Willie Ritchie, the great welterweight champion Jack Britton on multiple occasions, as well as Johnny Dundee. 5-weight champion Floyd Mayweather was boxing's pound-for-pound king, embarking on one of the most incredible careers in modern history and cementing an all-time great legacy. Mayweather's defensive skills are up there amongst the greatest of all time. And whilst during the most popular phase of his career, his Money Mayweather era, he consistently baffled the greatest fighters on the planet, in his younger days, during the Pretty Boy Floyd era, he was one of the most well-rounded fighters I've ever seen. Blessed with a vicious snap and a wonderful arsenal of punches, Mayweather pulled off what I believe is his greatest performance during this time against the primed, unbeaten Diego Corrales. In total, across an astonishing 50-0 career, Floyd defeated 23 different world champions, which in the modern era, with multiple world champions in each weight division, is unmatched. But when assessing on an all-time basis, alongside the old fighters who had one champion per 8 weight divisions, Mayweather's statistics still hold him in the highest possible regards. With 9 victories over Hall of Famers in Manny Pacquiao, Canelo Alvarez, Ricky Hatton, Oscar De La Hoya, Juan Manuel Marquez, Arturo Gatti, Corrales, Mosley and Cotto. Whilst Mayweather was consistently fighting the best in his early days, defeating top fighters like Genaro Hernandez, Diego Corrales and many others, when each respected champion was on a good run of form, one critique you could put on Mayweather, compared to those ahead of him on this list, was towards the latter end of his career, he was able to choose the timings of his fights a bit more carefully. Nevertheless, his resume, skill set, dominance and longevity are legendary. Sugar Ray Leonard is a true superstar of boxing. He had one of the most phenomenal careers in one of the most talent-stacked eras in history. The level of competition Leonard conquered in his prime hasn't been matched since, in my opinion. By the time Leonard was in his mid-20s, he'd already been involved in an array of fights that are deemed as the greatest of all time, whilst defeating prime versions of Roberto Duran, Thomas Hearns and Wilfred Benitez, 3 of the greatest fighters in history. Even in his only loss during his prime years, Leonard's stock rose as he went toe-to-toe with one of the greatest fighters in history in his absolute prime over a brutal 15 rounds in the legendary brawl in Montreal against Roberto Duran. In this fight, he proved he could fight up close with the best of them and had warrior's heart, but in the rematch, he showed his elite level mind games and his boxing skills. That adaptability and killer instinct was also shown in the Tommy Hearns fight, when in the grueling 13th and 14th rounds, Leonard, down on the cards, unleashed blistering combinations punches to secure the knockout. Around this time period, he also scored very good victories over Floyd Mayweather Sr., Davey Boy Green, Ayub Kaluli, amongst many others. And of course, there is his win against Marvin Haggler, who had been undefeated for years. Whilst this decision is somewhat controversial, I've always been of the opinion that Haggler throwing away the first 4 rounds made it extremely close. Whilst you could give it to either man, in my opinion, Leonard done just enough to win. He was a champion from welterweight to light heavyweight, having also knocked out Donnie Lalonde. The persistence, determination, longevity, wisdom and knockout percentage of Archie Moore are just unparalleled. He holds an unbreakable record of 132 career knockouts, the most ever by a world champion. But he wasn't just a fearsome puncher, he was an incredibly effective defensive fighter and counterpuncher who would fight into his 50s and would rule as the light heavyweight champion for 10 years despite winning the title at 39 years of age. During Archie Moore's rise, boxing was heavily controlled by the mob, and Archie would refuse to go by the mob's orders, meaning the chance of a title shot in his younger years was non-existent. So for around 14 years, Archie was boxing the greatest middleweights the sport's ever seen, alongside an array of the sport's most avoided and dangerous Hall of Famers, earning extremely little money with no glory on the line. Spanning between the ages of 25 to 39, Moore would step in with Hall of Famers, in top 50 all-timer Ezard Charles 4 times, a fellow top 50 all-timer in Charlie Burley, middleweight world champion Hall of Famer Teddy Yaros, and during those years he defeated Hall of Famers in Jimmy Bivens 3 times, light heavyweight champion Hall of Famer Harold Johnson twice, Holman Williams, Lloyd Marshall, Charlie Williams 3 times, Jack Chase 4 times, Burt Lytell on multiple occasions, with all of those names being in the infamous Black Murderers Row, a group of Black Hall of Fame fighters that were refused a title shot due to the colour of their skin and fought each other in a series of 60 fights known as the Murderers Row. Moore would eventually get his light heavyweight title shot at the age of 39, defeating the Hall of Fame light heavyweight champion Joey Maxim. Whilst Maxim would receive $100,000 for the bout, Moore would receive just $800. In his first few years as champion, he would defeat the Hall of Famer Harold Johnson again, Cuban legend Nino Valdez, and Hall of Famer Bobo Olsen, whilst also defeating Maxim a second time in a rematch, before moving up at the age of 41 to challenge Rocky Marciano for the heavyweight title, losing but dropping Rocky in the process. People see Moore's age in that fight and presume that he was way past his best, but this isn't the case. He still defeated top fighters in Howard King 4 times, Willie Besmanoff twice, and climbed off the canvas 4 times in one of the greatest comebacks ever seen against the extremely hard-punching Yvonne Durrell. With over 50 fights and 10 years as light heavyweight champion of the world, he was eventually stripped in 1962 of the titles at the age of 49. His reign is one of the longest in the sport's history, and at such an advanced age, it's absolutely incredible. He would also face off against heavyweight champion Floyd Patterson during that time, and in his second to last fight would face a young Muhammad Ali. In total, Archie Moore was involved in 27 fights against International Boxing Hall of Famers, spanning from middleweight to heavyweight, fighting these guys from the age of 25 to 50, winning 14 times. He has the most knockouts in boxing history for a world champion, and the longest reign in light heavyweight title history, reigning as heavyweight champion from 39 years old to 49 years old. Ezard Charles has a strong case for having the greatest resume on this list. Unfortunately, history has done him a great disservice, as his other worldly achievements have largely been forgotten around other popular fighters of the era. Within his first year and 17 fights as a professional, he was boxing Hall of Famers at middleweight, where he would defeat Hall of Famer Teddy Yaros, world champion Anton Christoforidis, and score a draw with Hall of Famer Ken Overlin. The next year, he would score back-to-back victories over the most avoided fighter in history, Charlie Burley, a man that's on this list, before moving up to light heavyweight to score back-to-back victories over the Hall of Fame champion Joey Maxim. His 7-year run at light heavyweight has seen him labelled the greatest light heavyweight in history. He would defeat the legendary Archie Moore on 4 different occasions, whilst also beating the champion and Hall of Famer Joey Maxim 5 different times out of 5. Despite being the greatest in the division's history, he was never granted a title shot at middleweight and light heavyweight. He opted to fight all of the legendary fighters in the Black Murderers Row, a group of Hall of Fame black fighters so good and so avoided that they had to fight amongst each other. Of this group of Hall of Famers, he beat Jimmy Bivens 4 times, Lloyd Marshall twice, El Murray, as well as the great light heavyweight champion Gus Lesnovich. Despite embarking on 2 Hall of Fame runs in 2 different divisions over 9 years, he was still yet to get a title shot. So he moved up to heavyweight, where he would become the first man in 12 years to defeat the great Joe Louis. He would finally become a world champion at heavyweight when he defeated the great Jersey Joe Walcott twice. He retained the titles on 8 different times, defeating contenders in Rex Lane, and would stop one of history's legendary punchers in Bob Satterfield. It's worth noting at this point in his career, his record was 71-5-1, and he cleared out the middleweight, light heavyweight, and almost the heavyweight divisions, barring Rocky Marciano, who we'll take on next. But before we get to the Marciano fights, it's worth noting that he unfortunately had killed an opponent in the ring, which in turn had made him lose that vicious streak he had in early days. In the first fight of Rocky Marciano, despite losing, he was the only man to go 15 rounds with the relentless champion. And in the rematch, Charles was 1 round away from stopping Marciano when one of his punches had split Marciano's nose in half, causing one of the most gruesome cuts in history. A testament to Marciano's greatness is that he went out to secure the knockout of that round. Otherwise, he wouldn't have retired undefeated. Almost all of Charles' losses are well past his best. In his prime, he lost just once in 42 fights, clearing out more Hall of Famers than almost anyone in history from middleweight to heavyweight. Willie Pep is one of boxing history's most graceful fighters ever and one of the best technicians to ever step in the ring. Widely regarded as the greatest defensive fighter in history, he would lose just 11 times in 240 fights. Boxing's featherweight champion throughout most of the 40s, Pep would embark on 2 of the most legendary unbeaten runs in history, accumulating consecutive streaks of 60 plus fights and 70 plus fights without a loss, at one point in time holding a record of 134 wins to just 1 defeat and 1 draw. Amazingly, during that second 70 plus fight streak, Pep was involved in a deadly plane crash that killed many on board and severely injured him, and although doctors said he'd never fight again, he would go on to have another 100 plus professional contests, many at the highest level. One of boxing's most fluid fighters who could effortlessly switch hit, make his opponents miss with ease with beautiful footwork and head movement, and remain ridiculously hard to read with his brilliant feints and continuous fast punches before he disappeared without a trace. The Will-o'-the-Wisp was so crafty, there's even a myth that he won a round without throwing a punch. Pep would defeat multiple fighters on this list in Sandy Sadler and Manuel Ortiz, and further Hall of Famers in Chalky Wright 3 times. He also defeated world champions in Sal Bartolo 3 times, Joey Archibald twice, Jackie Wilson twice, Phil Terranova, Paddy DeMarco and Harold Dade. On a textbook basis, Joe Louis may well have been the most perfect heavyweight in history, throwing every punch with no wasted movement and second to none technique wise. Still, over 80 years after his peak, the Ring magazine have him as the most dangerous puncher in history. What can't be debated is the fact that he's the most dominant fighter in history, especially at heavyweight. For just shy of 12 years, Louis was the heavyweight champion of the world that never took a loss. During this unparalleled reign of dominance, Louis would defend the heavyweight titles a staggering record-breaking 25 times. During his reign, he most impactfully avenged the only career defeat he'd suffered so far to the hands of Max Schmeling. Many deemed due to the timing of that fight and the very nature of it, the Louis-Schmeling rematch is the biggest fight in boxing history. The American Louis would defend his title against the German Schmeling, with the whole world watching and both countries' propaganda machines in full throttle. With history's most catastrophic war brewing, Louis went out and avenged his only defeat with a brutal first round knockout. Alongside this standout win, across his excellent career, he would beat fighters in this list like Billy Conn twice, Hall of Famers Max Baer, Jack Sharkey, Primo Carnera, John Henry Lewis, Jersey Joe Walcott twice, Paulino Azcudun, James J. Braddock, King Levinsky and many others. After initially retiring with a record of 58-1, having defeated every man he ever faced, and despite accumulating hefty purses for his career, Louis would have to return to the ring due to financial issues. During this second run, past his best, he would lose to the likes of Ezard Charles and get brutally knocked out by Rocky Marciano. However, he still beat the likes of Jimmy Bivins, a Hall of Famer. Muhammad Ali is boxing history's most iconic fighter, one of the most famous athletes in history and one of the most impactful athletes too. Ali's cultural impact has widely seen him voted as the 20th century's greatest athlete. Yet whilst he achieved amazing feats outside of the ring, inside the boxing ring, he was one of the most accomplished and talented heavyweight fighters in history. His speed, combination punching and movement revolutionised the heavyweight division. And in his prime, he was seemingly as unbeatable as any other fighter that's ever lived. His performance against Cleveland Williams is widely deemed as the greatest boxing performance in history. Yet the greatest tragedy is that we lost 3 years of his prime due to his ban. In his return, we saw his heart, amazing courage and all-time great chin being involved in some of the most brutal wars ever seen. Ali's fights against Foreman and Frazier are amongst the most famous that have ever occurred. He holds arguably the greatest resume ever seen in heavyweight boxing. with 2 wins over Joe Frazier, a knockout win against George Foreman, 2 wins over Sonny Liston, a further 2 wins over Ken Norton, Floyd Patterson, George Chuvalo and Henry Cooper, as well as Joe Bugner, further victories over Ernie Terrell, Jerry Quarry, Cleveland Williams, Zora Foley, Oscar Bonavina, heavyweight history's hardest puncher in Ernie Shavers, and the formidable Ron Lyle. Ali was the king of the most brutal heavyweight era in history. The Pittsburgh windmill Harry Greb's achievements border on mythical, mainly because there's no footage left of him fighting that survived. Nevertheless, Greb holds the most wins over Hall of Famers in boxing history by considerable margins. Whilst being the most dominant fighter of both the late 1910s and early 1920s, Greb compiled the best resume ever seen. He scored an unprecedented 49 wins out of 70 fights against either Hall of Famers or world champions from welterweight all the way up to heavyweight. In 1919 alone, he went 45-0, scoring 12 wins against International Boxing Hall of Famers, a run that would extend to 56-0 before a loss to Tommy Loughran. He would then go on another 50-plus fight unbeaten streak. He was perhaps the most fearless fighter in history, handing Gene Tunney his only defeat in a 5-fight series, whilst also defeating other fighters on this list in Tommy Loughran and Mickey Walker. He would defeat Hall of Famer Battling Levinsky 6 times, as well as Jeff Smith 6 times, Jack Dillon twice, Leo Hawke 3 times, Tommy Loughran 4 times and Tommy Gibbon twice. Whilst dominating welterweights, middleweights and light heavyweights, he had a campaign at heavyweight where he defeated all of Jack Dempsey's contenders as well as his future conqueror in Gene Tunney. Desperate for a fight at Dempsey, the middleweight champion Greb would beat Dempsey up in sparring. He never drew the colour line, defeating Black Hall of Famers in Tiger Flowers and Kid Norfolk, and would do most of this completely blind in one eye. He was stopped just twice in 299 fights, one due to a broken arm, and consistently won 15 and 20 rounders. Henry Armstrong's run through the weight divisions may be the most unbelievable achievement in history. In just under a 4-year span, Armstrong went 59-1 with 51 knockouts from featherweight to middleweight, and this just alone was his peak. Around this, he beat many Hall of Famers through his career. Armstrong was the most relentless fighter I've ever seen. He would constantly bob and weave on the front foot with one of the most awkward yet effective defences I've seen, and once he was on your chest, would unrelentingly pound away. He supposedly had an abnormal heart rate, which would be a good indicator as to why no one was able to keep up with his intensity over 15 rounds. And his career achievements are almost unmatched. He would become the featherweight champion of the world before moving up to become the lightweight champion of the world whilst he still held the featherweight belt. Whilst being the 2-division champion in the 8-belt era, he would also go up to win the welterweight title, being history's only ever simultaneous 3-division champion. And better yet, whilst holding titles from 126 to 147 pounds, all at the same time, he made a record-breaking 19 defences of that welterweight title, which to this day has never been beaten. He would also defeat middleweight champion Seferino Garcia, and in the rematch for the title, was robbed of the middleweight world title. To put this into modern context, Armstrong dominated 7 weight divisions all at the same time, mainly knocking everyone out. And his career victories are absolutely littered with Hall of Famers. Sugar Ray Robinson is the greatest boxer of all time in my opinion for so many different reasons. One of the best all-rounders ever seen, extremely tough, never being knocked out in 200 pro fights. Robinson had a near unrivaled ability to throw combination punches. Both of his hands were blessed with legendary power, compiling over 100 career knockouts, while scoring some of the most vicious knockouts in history in combinations and single punches, most notably his left hook against Gene Foreman, which is widely regarded as the greatest left hook ever thrown. In his prime, his dominance was unmatched, losing just once in his first 120 plus fights and going on a 91 fight unbeaten streak at welterweight and middleweight. And even when he moved up to middleweight and light heavyweight and began to take losses against some of the most brutal sluggers in boxing history, he would often produce fight of the year efforts in defeat and would always win the rematches, becoming a 5-time middleweight champion of the world. His resume is amongst the most stacked ever, with victories over Hall of Famers and world champions in Jake LaMotta 5 times, Bobo Olsen 4 times, Kid Gavilan twice, Sammy Angot 3 times, Fritzy Zivic twice, Henry Armstrong, Gene Foreman, Carmen Basilio, Rocky Graziano, Paul Pender, Denny Moyer, Wilf Greaves, Randolph Turpin and many others. After achieving all of this, at the age of 38, his record was 143-6-2, Yet he would still box into his 40s, where he would take most of his losses.